today I'll be talking a little bit about artifacts and how we want to define it and how we want to think about it. So in the last few days, I've actually met a few people that are doing relevant work, and so there's a lot of good work going on in this domain. And I'd like to just thank the conference for having me. So I want to start out with the questions. So I was just curious, just by raise of hand if you had heard of a more formal definition, like a kind of a definition of a digital forensic artifact. A few? Okay. So a lot of you didn't raise your hand, and that's actually kind of why we did this, because we looked at some past literature and we realized, okay, well, there's no cohesive definition here. Everyone's using their own terms. So the first thing we did, well, this is important for communication and sharing. So the thing is, right now we have tools that support finding evidence, but when you want to share it between different jurisdictions, for instance, you may be investigating the same criminal and you might not even know it. So that kind of poses a problem. Another thing that is often that's common is if you want to share it, you often have to convert proprietary formats. So that's another thing that is an obstacle. So we wanted to kind of push solving this issue. So the first thing we did was we looked at linguistic definitions, and we went through a couple of common major dictionaries, and we looked at how they defined it, also in terms of paleontology, because everyone knows if you dig up something, you call it an artifact. But we wanted to see why do they call it that. And then we also looked at a few cyberforensics specific definitions. And so Cybox had one, and the scientific working groups for digital evidence and imaging technology, they also proposed another definition. And then, of course, we had a few papers, academic papers that we found, where before using the term, they kind of tried to clarify how they were going to define it. So between all these definitions, we looked at the commonalities and saw that artifacts are often artificial or created by some sort of external force from your perspective. They have antecedent temporal relation, meaning that they have a history, some sort of event in the past. That's the importance of it. They're exceptional, whether it be from accidentally being produced, something unexpected, whether they be rare, or interesting to a particular individual. And we're trying to move a little bit away from that last perspective because that tends to be a little less standardized. And then, of course, legality and science, and that's what makes our domain our domain, so we added that to the list. So this is a little a snippet from our our appendix. And so what we did was we looked through 26 academic papers, and we identified items that they use the term to describe. And then a lot of these papers have their own categorizations for the items themselves. But if that didn't exist, we used an educated guess and we came up with our own categories. And then what we did was for each paper, we classified that into one of 4 perspectives. So the one that you can see up there is researcher. And that's kind of what I just described, where it was almost arbitrary from paper to paper what they used the term to describe. Even within the same paper, it would actually vary from item to item. Then we had investigator, which is a more high-level abstract concept. They use the term to describe the fact that they were interested in something, but they didn't even know what they were looking for, what that thing was. None of them didn't know the properties of it. The third perspective was tool perspective. So a lot of tools create reports. They allow you to export items. And so we classified papers that had to do specifically with tools. We used the tool perspective for. And then our final one was database collector. And this was more of another kind of somewhat arbitrary classification where they basically used the term for anything that they were collecting and putting in a database. So then the third thing we did was we looked at ontologies and schemas that have been around for a while. So again, in the last few days I've kind of realized that there's been some other work in this area, and it's moved from when we originally were looking at this. Mr. Van Beek, who from the Netherlands Forensic Institute, talked about Xeraf and their system for uploading items, and another one was sticks and defects, which are now, I guess, in the later stage, kind of moving to something else. So that's another thing that's been worked on by Sean Bernard over there from MITRE. So DSO is another one that we looked at. Sticks and defects are very high level. It helps you correlate different perspectives of criminal events, victim events, machine low-level technical things that happen. But DSO was something that was a little more hierarchical. So it had, you have a device class, and then below the device class you could have mobile devices, you could have IoT, you could have laptops or desktops. And for us, we thought that was a little bit too rigid. And for that, maybe that reason, it hasn't been very commonly used. However, we did like the idea of location first type. So what they proposed is that artifacts can have a type, and if two items have the same type, they're directly comparable, both at a low level and a high level perspective. So you can say this is the same type of item maybe that we've seen earlier in a different case. And so we kind of incorporated that idea a little bit into our model. Location, again, I'll talk a little bit about later, but the point is you want to be able to represent it in a meaningful way where you can find an item across different platforms, different types of devices. And UCO is the Universal Cyber Ontology, and that's another higher level ontology that tries to use other types of ontologies as well. So having multiple ontologies is a way to circumvent being too stuck in the corner into different domains. So then we looked at schemas. So schemas were the low-level technical representation of things, and what we realized was that Xeraf and DFXML are great schemas, but they're not widely used. They also kind of lacked a more comprehensive approach, and so we proposed we used some sidebox cyber observables for our model. Then the fourth thing we did was we had archival science. So archival science is kind of like the library science of digging up something. Maybe like if you think about paleontology again, you put it through a process and then you store it, but you have all this documentation on how that was done. And so there's some similarities between our domain and archival science. So we focus on acquiring, authenticating, and preserving items, but then we try to minimize any alterations that happen to the items, and we document that entire process. And of course, we want easy retrieval. However, the one thing we don't have as solid foundation on is the way we represent retrieval, the policies that we put in place to retrieve things. And so the solution to this is kind of a sense of curation. Again, that there's a way to for scientists, analysts to enter things into a database, for instance, and therefore in the future you can easily refer back to previous cases. So besides looking at previous work, the other thing we did was we ran a survey. This survey was targeted at, again, identifying how people think about artifacts, what they think the categories should be, what they think the fields should be to describe them. And so we had 54 Likert scale questions, 12 free response, and 4 multiple choice. The free response questions, we looked, because some of the questions people answered with varying styles, of writing. We looked for phrases that were commonly mentioned. And unfortunately, some of the people didn't respond to all the questions, so we had a somewhat smaller sample size. So that's a place where we could improve on. But just to give you an idea, we had of our demographic, we had about half the respondents had 7 years more of experience, older than 34, and were Americans. So the themes that we found from the survey, evidentiary value was the most common thing mentioned by most of the respondents. And then the other thing was applying digital forensic analysis techniques. So those are two things that we thought we should then incorporate into a definition. And almost all people thought that hardware should not be considered an artifact, so devices themselves should not be considered an artifact. And then from, of course, the Likert questions, we had some categories that they mentioned, and the free response and the Likert questions, we had categories that we came up with, and the most common ones were these files, number of packets, memory, application data. This is just an image of the types of questions, the Likert questions that we put up there. So on the left, you can see some of the items that we listed for them to say, I strongly agree this should be an artifact, or I strongly disagree this should be an artifact. So some of the items were a little bit surprising, but for the most part, again, we're seeing a lot of variance in how people interpret things. And then on the right, you can see the categories that we proposed. We also had the free responses, which asked them to propose other categories that we had not put in the Likert questions. And then we had database fields, which would be properties under each category for a technical low-level representation. Another thing we got from the survey was an investigative procedure. So we had two questions where we asked if you, and this was again targeted both towards researchers and practitioners, but we asked what are the steps that you would take to research an artifact? And we asked that for known artifacts, artifacts they had seen before, and artifacts they hadn't seen before. And so we asked them to come up with a list, or not a list, a stepwise procedure. And so what we did was we then merged those together and created this kind of investigative procedure that we think could be used to use an artifact database, but also train practitioners. So the first thing you would do is obviously you would acquire it, back up the artifact, but then you would check your database and see, are there procedures that have been helpful in the past, and will it be helpful here? So you go try those. If that wasn't the case, then what you would do is you would try to classify it at the low-level perspective. So again, I mentioned SciBox, so you might try to classify it into a cyber observable and say, okay, well these items had similar traits, and so therefore maybe this approach might work. And then, of course, if nothing works, then you want to analyze, you want to maybe reverse engineer the item itself, or at least make it non-harmful. And at least that can be an approach that if, at least in a live manner, it can help cope with the problem. And then, of course, the final step would be to create a report so that we can easily export this information and it can be shared among the domain. So finally, this is our proposal. We came up with a linguistic kind of definition, again, based on the survey, based on the previous definitions we used, based on the papers we looked at. So these are all things that we think should be requirements for something to be considered an artifact and put into a vetted database. So, it must be curated, it must have location, must have some sort of evidentiary value, and it must be, an external force artificially created from like a tool perspective, or the system created it. And then, of course, temporal relation, it has to have meaning to the past. So up there I say the location is optional. So I want to stress that the reason we say that is in most cases we want to grab the lowest hanging fruit. So if there's a low level technical way to represent it at the sector level, if it's a key or value pair for maybe registry, you would want to represent it that way. However, in some cases, it might not be meaningful to say the location because it might not be cross-domain, cross-platform. So this is our model, I guess. So we have, again, the requirements in the middle, and then on the top we have a high-level way of thinking about things. And I want to stress again that this is to be used with different ontologies. I'm not trying to promote SciBox per se or whatever it is, DSO, defect. The point is, this is the way we should think about things, and we want to push a discussion so that we can come up with a model which sets these requirements and then uses them to classify items in a way that's meaningful and useful. So in the bottom, in this case, we use sidebox, and so we, as Devin will talk about our genome project in a bit, that's kind of a side project of this, or what inspired this work, I guess. He started with 88 cyber observables, so he deemed that not all the sidebox objects were completely appropriate for these requirements. So that's just an example of how you could use a low-level schema to represent information. So our contribution, again, is the linguistic definition and kind of this way to think about things. It's a work in progress, so it needs, we need more discussion, we need more input, especially between different three-letter agencies. And I mentioned our genome project, so that is a way for us to start beta testing how we should think about this. And you may have seen this if you went to the demo the other day. This is some of the items, some of the cyber observables that we put into AGP. So some of the things that we do have in AGP, we have tagging for searching, I guess, CuFAs within CuFAs. We want to implement pointers so that you can follow the investigative process from one cyber observable to the next. And we also want to stress that using a database might also help extrapolate higher level information that we currently are not getting. By having a database where things are connected, we can do analytics or statistical analysis on what cases are maybe having what types of cyber CuFAs. So again, I want to stress this is a work in progress, and what we really need is we need different agencies, different people who are developing these different ontologies and using these different schemas to come together and merge these ontologies together, or at least develop an ontology that encompass those, like ECO. And this may be a combination of them. I'd like to stress that there's no one ontology that we're trying to say this should be the answer. It might be a combination of them all. So future work. So again, we had a small sample size for the survey. Unfortunately, some of the free response questions were not phrased in the best way, because it's an abstract concept to begin with. People interpret it differently, and therefore we couldn't use all the free responses that we got. And then, of course, a decline to respond option that one of the reviewers mentioned that might help improve our the way that we did our survey. So finally, we need tools. So if we are to use a database like the NFI database or AGP, we need a way to easily export things and also, again, share it between different people that are in different parts of the process. So one of them that has been around is OSX Auditor. It's now OSX Collector, and this is a tool which allows you to easily zip up system log files and other information to give to another investigator. But currently there's not many, and so if we can develop plugins for these databases, it would be very beneficial to share that information. So that's all I have for today. I'd like to thank Google for the scholarship, the Department of Homeland Security for funding AGP, and the other authors and AGP developers who helped put in some ideas to this project.
Hi, Vic.
Yep.
Great job, thank you. In your paper, you mentioned that you guys consulted some archaeology and archival science papers. Right. Can you speak a little bit more to the things that you found in those fields that you have liked, that you have also tried to maybe adopt into the digital forensics field with regard to CuFA?
Okay. So we mainly looked at one paper because there was a paper that actually focused on that issue specifically, archival science versus cyber forensics or digital forensics. Again, I think the biggest thing that we got out of that was the curation process. The fact that right now there's no standard for how we would upload something, for instance. If you're going to upload an item to a database or share it with someone else, you need a way to classify it. And right now, we don't have a way where, if I was to do it and then someone else was to do it, they would do it in completely different manners. And they might use different fields for tagging, which in some cases might result in loss of information. So the biggest thing that we got out of that was the curation process. We think that having a process that's standardized, that requires people to follow this process will help not only that entering the information, but also retrieving information and storing it properly. So that's mainly what we got out of that. I mean, we only looked at really one paper for that. I'm not aware if there's other papers, there might be, but that's about what we did.
I have this question for the speaker. How does CuFA compare to something like the Forensic Artifact Project that is currently integrated into your?
So CuFA specifically?
Yeah. Or well,
because CuFA is kind of the way to think about it, or it's more of pushing the definition and the model itself, but it would be using a schema or an ontology. Or several. So again, I mean, maybe if you're talking about the Artifact Genome Project, I guess I could make some people about that. But I think Devin might actually know more about that. But
any other questions? Okay, let's thank the speaker one more time.